Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Ransomware Defense in 2022, sponsored by Cisco Secure, Corelight, ExtraHop, Gigamon, and Morphisec. My name is Carol, author of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Matt Bromley, SANS analyst, Chris Borales, Senior Product Marketing Manager at Gigamon, Thomas Clavel, Director of Product Marketing at ExtraHop, and Michael Gorlick, CTO of Morphisec. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the Q&A window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Matt.
Excellent. Carol, thank you so much. Just a quick check, you can hear me on audio.
Yes.
Yes, excellent. All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. If you've been with me on a webcast before and you notice things look a little different in my world, I'm actually joining you from beautiful sunny California today. So if you find yourself in Pacific time, I'm not going to lie, I'm starting to understand why you like this weather so much. But for everyone else joining us, happy you're here with us. Really excited to get this started. This is going to be a really, really fun session. This is actually kind of part two of a session that we've done before, speaking directly towards ransomware defenses. We did do a ransomware and IR focused paper towards the end of last year, the end of 2021. In that paper, we wanted to spend some time talking about the different trends that we're seeing from adversaries, different types of defenses and things along those lines. In this one, we kind of continued that a little bit forward. We're talking about some of the trends that are still there, as well as continuing to talk about things that we're seeing from threat actors and what to look for next. So this is our SANS 2022 Ransomware Defense Report. I'm not going to make any promises, but this may just be part one of a multi-part series, depending on how the year goes for us. We're obviously seeing a lot of tumultuous times when it comes to the cyber threat landscape, which is one way I'll phrase that. But a huge thanks. Alec just threw a link into the chat for us. And I want to let everyone know that the paper is available for download. You're more than welcome. We highly encourage you to check that out, and please read through that. The way that today's webcast is going to work, it's going to be a little bit different from kind of our normal webcast. We've got about a next 25 minutes or so is going to be me talking about the report and what we published. And I'll be the first to say this is not a conclusive multi-100-page look at the state of all ransomware operations right now. This is more of that, here's where we see the most success from an adversary perspective. So here's where we see you and your organization to be able to get the most success as well. We're then going to get into, we've got a brief introduction we've got quite a few people joining us today on the panel. I'm excited to have Chris, Mike, and Tom join me. We're going to give them a little bit of an intro or time to introduce themselves. Then we're going to jump into our panel discussion where between the four of us, we're going to bounce around some ransomware ideas, talk about things that we see, answering different questions. And on that note, Q&A is open, everyone. I know we're on Zoom. I know you all know how to use Zoom. It's 2022 now. So with that being said, if you've got questions, if you've got things you'd like to submit to us, please go ahead and submit those questions and we'll rope them into our discussion. Be more than happy to do that. But with that said, let's go ahead and get started, and I'll break into the 2022 Ransomware Defense Report first, because I think that's where we're going to have a really good kind of foundation set for today's discussion. So as mentioned, I'm going to have three people, 4 of us total joining me today. My name is Matt Bromley. I'm with the SANS Analyst Program. We're also going to have Chris Borales, who's over at Gigamon, Thomas Clavel, who's over at ExtraHop. Tom, I apologize if it's Clavel or Clavel, either one. I apologize. Hope I said it right. And then Michael Gorlick, who's over at Morphisec as well. Between the four of us, we're going to have a really good discussion about kind of what's going on, state of ransomware, and things to look for in the future. Okay, a few notes about the things that we're going to be looking at and talking about today. First, we're going to be getting into what I'm calling the ransomware era. I'm going to kind of define this and quantify what that means for a little bit. I think that we're seeing kind of a different landscape from a cyber perspective, especially because ransomware just continues to plague the news left, right, and center and everywhere we look. We're then going to talk about some of the common adversary trends we see these days. I then want to get into some of the defenses. We've actually got 2 case studies that we'll outline from a defense perspective. I think both case studies gives a really kind of encompassing point of view of ways to defend against these types of attacks. And then we're going to get into our introductions. I'm going to bring Chris, Mike, and Tom on board. And then we're going to get into our panel discussion for the latter portion of today's webcast. All right. And with that said, we'll go ahead and get started in ransomware. Let me see here. Okay, the ransomware era. This I wanted to make more of a discussion before we start to get into some of our defenses and our trends. There we go. Perfect. So before we do that, when I say ransomware era, I really want to take a look back at the past, maybe 5, 6, 7 years of what we've seen on the ransomware side of things, the ransomware perspective. I feel like a few years ago, and I've said this on multiple webcasts before, in the event that we had a ransomware incident, when this first came about, 2014, 2015, ransoms were very, very low monetary figures, number one. And number two, they were more like nuisance attacks than anything else. I do know some smaller businesses who couldn't really afford those smaller ransom payments and unfortunately got stuck with kind of not having access to critical systems, not being able to kind of recover from not having access to something, versus now where we've got educated threat actors who are very aware of their victim environments. They are knowledgeable, and we're going to talk about this with some of our trends as well. Not only that, but they've also got the ability to really negotiate and move the negotiations past simply demands for money, but more into those extortion, shaming, and whatnot phases where organizations unfortunately get put in a really tough position from a media perspective, from a monetary and stock perspective. And that's obviously something that we kind of, don't want to see happen. But we've got adversaries who push us towards those places. So that's kind of, maybe point number one about this being the ransomware era. Point number two of this being the ransomware era just happens to be the sheer prevalence of these attacks that are out there. If you think back, maybe 10 years ago, which I'll happily, lazily call the heyday of APT or something like that, the biggest issues we had to deal with were things like cyber espionage, theft of IP theft, big financial crimes. If anyone remembers 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, those were like the really big credit card theft days, pushed the entire industry towards those encrypted PIN pads, tap payments. Like we see these waves and forces come through. And that's not to say that any of them have gone. I think we still see a healthy amount of state espionage out there. There's still a lot of financial fraud out there as well. Take a look at some of the big cryptocurrency hacks that take place. But I think we've just seen this kind of shift into the one that everyone talks about these days is ransomware. And what I mean by that is we've got boards who base their decisions and base their implementations based off of ransomware. They buy insurance policies to defend against ransomware, things like that. There's lots of different changes that have occurred and have really kind of pushed the needle towards other places. And I think that's where ransomware has become that like staple type of attack that we just have to deal with for a while. I'm hoping it will start to fade away, but I've said it before and I'll say it again, as long as we continue to see this be a multi-billion-dollar industry, which it is, we're going to continue to see the effects of it and the impact of it on cyber as well. The third point that I'll make about this being the ransomware era, if you will, is the speed with which attacks take place. And I'm going to talk about this as one of our adversary trends, but I'll offer some insight here when it comes to things like rapid weaponization of vulnerabilities, which we've seen before, and we're going to talk about in depth in just a moment. And when you really take that kind of mean time to ransomware deployment, and what I mean by that, and I'm going to use this discussion to kind of segue into one of the adversary trends that I know about. It's that rapid weaponization phase where we've got a really, really fast, and I mean a really fast move from vulnerability announcement to potential deploying of ransomware, as weird as that sounds. And then there's some counters, and I've got some colleagues and friends who actually kind of set that counter as to how quickly do we go from weaponization of a vulnerability to deployment of ransomware in a victim environment. And that's really maybe the first trend that I'll talk about from an adversary trend perspective. It's a race. It's a race between when a vulnerability is announced and how quickly can it be weaponized versus how quickly can we patch against it. But the subtle timer in there is how quickly can we go from, or not how quickly can we, but how quickly do adversaries go from vulnerability to ransomware? And I see a lot of security teams actually base their responses and base their patching schedules and base really the way that they're going to deal with an incident based on those particular timetables. How quickly are we moving to ransomware? Now, really what we're doing is we're trying to assess how quickly do we move to an impactful attack taking place. Because I've seen vulnerability patching schedules before, and they're oftentimes very slow. They're highly defined on change controls. They are entirely dependent upon when can we do a thing. We'll just accept the cyber risk until then, number one. Instead, we see these kinds of questions such as, well, who's taking advantage of this vulnerability? How quickly are they moving from point A to point B? And how big is that impact when they get there? Because it's helping reshape the risk assessment landscape as well. It's helping redefine how quickly will we move on something. And I think that's, an important thing to keep in mind when it comes to the ransomware era, if you will, is really just assessing how ransomware has kind of changed a lot of the landscape for us. And that's what I mean when I call it the ransomware era, but it leads into these adversary trends. And rapid weaponization is one that I highlighted in the paper and one that I'll talk about now in a little more detail. Take things like Log4j, one of those big vulnerabilities that has come about. When I say big, I mean wide reaching. How many people does it impact? How many people does it touch? How many pieces of software does it impact and whatnot? And then we look at things from a vulnerability announcement to a proof of concept code or a working exploit in a matter of hours. It's a matter of hours before these things take place. So unfortunately, that means that security teams have got to move quickly within those windows. I, however, know a lot of teams who weren't even aware of a vulnerability. They weren't even aware of a patch until a breach had occurred or until a potential breach or a scan or something had taken place. Now, this actually creates a little bit of a weird situation for ransomware threat actors as well as for organizations as well. So we have this issue where we've got this kind of rapid weaponization of exploits, this rapid pushing or rapid moving of code in order to very quickly gain entry or gain access into an environment. But the flip side of that is we also now have more threat actors than we had before. So we now have multiple threat actors taking advantage of multiple pieces of code, taking advantage of multiple vulnerable environments. And this creates a weird, inverse one-to-many relationship. So one exploit can lead to multiple threat actors into an environment, which is multiple breaches. You might have one looking for ransom, one looking to ransom, one looking to gain access to your email, one looking to deploy a web shell or some other tertiary or secondary method. Long story short, it's not always going to be one threat actor in your environment. That's kind of step number one. Step two, though, or it's not step two, but maybe the inverse of that inverse is you can also neutralize these multiple threat actor or this multiple threat actor problem with one patch or one upgrade. And I'm aware I'm talking about patching as something that's much easier said than actually done, if you will. But think about kind of that one-to-many relationship as a benefit for adversaries, but it's also a benefit for us defenders, as benefit for security teams as well. It's not always just, you've got to be constrained or you're going to get breached no matter what. Someone's going to find a way in. It could be, someone could find a way in, but we're going to try and close as many doors as we can. And the more doors I can close, the better. We're going to talk about this when we get into some of our defense discussions as well. The next trend that I want to make sure we discuss is one that I think is probably the scariest of all for organizations who just aren't prepared or aren't ready for this. And this is where adversaries really know their victims. They know the victims that they're going after. They know the victim environments, and they do their homework, as weird as that sounds. And I hate to say this, but there's times where I've worked breaches where adversaries know more than the folks on the other side of the environment do. I've of course seen the opposite, where ransomware authors have said, hey, we've breached your environment. Someone's come back and said, no, you definitely have not. In fact, I personally had data locked up in one incident where an adversary said XYZ, and we said, no, you only have half of X, we promise. But the flip side is, a lot of organizations just, not only are they not prepared for a cyber attack, they're not prepared for the impact of, we know more about your environment than you do. We also know more about you than you thought we would. And this, I think, goes back to that trend of, it kind of used to be this high-level board discussion / nuisance thing / we'll just buy an insurance policy to make this go away. We'll check that box and be done, as opposed to in the thick of a breach, the thick of it, you're dealing really with a knowledgeable adversary, which is never fun. The case study I like to use for this one, this is a publicly known thing, so it's not, I'm not releasing any private details here. It was Broward County Public Schools in Florida. I believe this was around this time, or about maybe mid-year last year, 2021. The school district got locked up and they demanded a $40 million ransom. Now, on the surface, if any of us, I think, were to look at this and say, wow, 40 million from a school district, like, what are they imagining? We got political issues with getting free lunches approved, and now we got folks asking for $40 million in ransom. Until it was kind of publicly announced and the adversaries came out and said, look, we've studied your financials. A, we locked them up, and B, it's public. We know this is only 1% of your budget. And the thing I find interesting about this is, very rarely do cyber threat actors not, unless they're in there for IP theft, or unless they're in there for espionage and things like that. I tend to think that most research, when we think of research of a victim, we think of kind of scanning the internal network, understanding the internal assets, identifying systems, so on and so forth. There's another level of sophistication, and that's not a compliment to adversaries. This is a warning for those who are unprepared for attacks. There's another level of sophistication when your adversary comes to the negotiation table and says, look, I know how much your budget is. I know how much money you have. I know, what was surplus last year versus what's not. And then let me take that to the next level. And when an adversary says, hey, before we locked up your financial servers or your financial file servers, we took a look at some spreadsheets. We know you have cash reserves of XYZ. Take that to kind of the ultimate step of adversaries really doing their research and saying, you're telling me you can't pay this, but I know you have that. Tell you what, I will cut you a deal and I'll take half of this instead of that. Or, there is a really scary comparison between having access to sensitive documents and then then using those against you at the same time. And I think, we're starting to see that knowledge of victims and using that in tactics and negotiation skills as an adversary benefit. The other kind of underlying subtlety that I'll drop here is, and we will talk about ransomware as a service in just a few moments, but when it comes to things like ransomware being a multi-billion-dollar business, I think adversaries have learned, hey, we need to get some negotiators in here, for lack of a better term. We'll hold out. We'll make a demand of $1 million. We'll hold out for a week or two if it means we get 200K. We'll hold out for 100K because the money doesn't cost us anything. I ransom your environment. All we're doing now is exchanging chat messages until I get what I want. So they'll continue to kind of hang on to that because they know that if I start high, I'm bound to get something in the lower side. And then they've created this weird psychological thing of, well, you got a deal because I asked for 40 and you paid me 10, but I still made 10 million for nothing. So once you get into that multi-billion-dollar business stage, you're going to start to see advancements in the way that business is conducted. But getting down to the knowledge of victims, I think this requires adversaries to have two things. They need to understand the kind of perimeter / attack surface of their victims because that's their way in. We will talk about, like I said, ransomware as a service and ransomware brokers in just a moment. But, if I was on the defense side of things and I know my adversary comes to the table a kind of knowledgeable negotiator, then I would use that to my advantage. And I would say, cool, I need to know as much about my attack surface, as much about my perimeter, my external facing devices as I possibly can. The other really embarrassing part about this, when I talk about adversaries knowing their victims, is you definitely don't want to have an adversary come to the table and say, hey, I ransom XYZ. And your security team responds and says, we don't even have that. And then it come to find out later on, oh, wait, we actually do. If anyone remembers, I think it was the beginning of 2020, we had the kind of Citrix NetScaler vulnerabilities, or the application, the ADC appliances. We were suffering a pretty big vulnerability that led to rapid weaponization and rapid ransomware deployment as well, or at least attempts by adversaries to do that. There was multiple companies I worked with who on Monday morning had no Citrix devices in their environment, and on Tuesday were responding to a data breach because they just didn't know it was in there. That's not really the place we want you to be. I don't want my adversary to know about an asset before my security team does. So my pro tip on here is exactly that. Don't let an adversary know more about your perimeter than a security team. Whether you like it or not, adversaries do their homework and their research. This helps their credibility when they demand a ransom payment, and it also gives them the ability to lock up more of the environment. I worked with organizations that have suffered a ransomware attack before, but the ransomware attack was in such an insignificant part of their network, didn't matter. No one was fazed by it. We just shut the systems down, rebuilt them, redeployed them, whatever, and moved on because they had knowledge and visibility of what was there and what wasn't there. When you don't have that knowledge and visibility, it can get pretty pricey trying to either figure that out or simply paying the ransom to find out, oh, this was data we didn't really need anyways. The adversaries had nothing. We should have known that. We should have done our research ahead of time. Not the situation I want anyone here to be in. We already talked about rapid weaponization as an adversary trend. The other one that I'll focus on, and this is going to become I think a good point of discussion amongst my panelists and myself as well, is the idea of fileless malware. Now, this is not new, everyone. This is not a new thing in the information security world whatsoever. The reason I'm bringing this up is because I see this as a continuing trend that just continues to tick up every year. Now, whether it's a 1% tick or a 10% tick, it still continues to move up every year. And I think this is where, until the point of actual ransom, we're seeing more and more use of in-memory malware, native binaries on the system, pulling from remote locations, storing malware in places outside of the disk. And I think there's a few reasons that this is taking place, and it's important to understand all of them as defenders. First, it's much easier to evade detections. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations still implement detections based on disk artifacts or disk objects. And that is certainly, a detection technique or a prevention technique that works, assuming that your adversary is going to leave all of those things on there. But we have to look at the trends and say, there's a reason why something like Cobalt Strike is so popular amongst adversaries. And the answer is really simple. It's not no offense to the Cobalt Strike devs, it's not the interface, it's not, the wonderful logos or artwork or the support that comes with it. It's because it's easy, and because, more importantly, it works. If I tell it to build and give me a beacon that runs in memory and evades detection by hiding inside of network traffic and domain fronting, and it just works every time I do it, guess what? That's what I'm going to do until it doesn't work anymore. So we see these deployments of very, very, very tiny binaries, or perhaps spearfishes that launch a piece of code. External exploit is downloaded, code is deployed in memory, very little artifacts touch the disk at all, and the adversary goes from one to many systems very quickly. And of course, I'm generalizing a lot of this. I'm not saying it's easy to get that done, but once you get into the right environment with the right credentials, adversaries move quickly through these turnstiles. It does not take them long. And this is an easy way for them to hide in plain sight. I don't get into the discussion of offensive security tools here and various toolkits, and I'm by no means throwing shade at only Cobalt Strike or trying to throw shade and saying we don't need those types of tools. I instead want to look at the trend of how come every time I read about a ransomware case study or a ransomware threat actor, I see the same toolkits mentioned again and again and again. And it's highly evasive, obfuscated PowerShell scripts. It's spearfishes with in-memory launches. It's Office macros. It's things that do not involve multiple binaries being dropped all over the system. It's use of native SMB. It's use of stolen credentials to take advantage of Windows binaries. It's various techniques that abuse Windows executables to download a file so I don't have to roll my own downloader when I get into the environment. I keep hearing and seeing those in reports again and again, and I have to think there's a reason why it's there. It's because it works. It's also, when I say it works, I mean, not only does it achieve the function that I needed to achieve, like downloading the thing or launching the whatever, but it also means I don't have to pay. If I'm a ransomware author or a ransomware broker, I'm not paying someone to build malware for me, and that's a much better place to be. So the pro tip that I've got here for everyone is really, look, technology is at a point where we can implement strong prevention capabilities. I'm just going to call this out right now. If you're at an organization with the budget for endpoint detection or some sort of detection technologies in place, and you're still relying just on disk artifacts, talk to your vendors. Talk to your suppliers. If you're just at that AV level and only AV, I'm going to highly recommend looking at kind of next, I'm not going to say next gen, but I'm going to say looking at technologies that do more for you. They protect you a lot better. So by placing a lot of the prevention and detection in memory, we're closer to the current adversary trends than ever before. And I'll be honest with you, it's really, depressing. It's hurtful when you see an organization deploy AV or some other sort of low-level detection or evasion technology, and then just get completely owned by a ransomware threat actor. And there's kind of that, deer in headlight look of like, well, we had something, why didn't it do anything? And it's essentially saying, I put a 1-inch wall up in front of a professional hurdler, and I'm wondering why they didn't trip on it. Does that mean they can never trip on it? No, but the chances of them doing so is very, very, very low. So, also take a look at higher levels of fidelity for detection, and look for opportunities you can to defeat those adversaries that can kind of snake their way through. Talk to your vendors about, how do you handle the abuse of native Windows system binaries? How do you handle things like, evasion of network detection and things like that? And really look at kind of what you need in order to defend against these types of attacks. Now, I will add in here, because the next thing we're going to talk about is going to be automation. When it comes to things like fileless malware and blocking against adversary TTPs, there is a plus. There is a win for organizations here. There is a win for your security team, which is, while this presentation is focused on just ransomware, these are not the only threat actors that utilize these. So if I'm asking you to consider maybe looking at better endpoint defenses or better better detection and prevention capabilities, I just want you protected against threats. Ransomware is a subset of those threats. It's a big subset, but it's just part of them. It's not all of them. The last and final trend that we'll look into before we get into some of our case studies is going to be that of increased automation. This is one where I think we have a crossover between highly skilled adversaries from an infrastructure perspective, as well as the ransomware as a service and ransomware brokers that we see as well. And we, quite frankly, see levels of automation that exceed a lot of their victims. I've read about, investigated, and worked on cases that involve adversaries that are more automated than multi-billion-dollar organizations are. And this is a really weird juxtaposition, because we've got all this great automation technology out there, and it seems like adversaries have taken the best advantage of it. Adversaries are the ones who have done the most with it. And unfortunately, that means we've had to keep up with them, but it means they can deploy quickly as well. There's a great blog post. I think when we get to some of the introductions from Chris, Mike, and Tom, I'll throw a link into the chat for everyone. There's a great blog post out there on the dforreport.com that talks about going from 0 to domain admin in a matter of hours, I believe. And you can just see in between the lines how the adversaries were just ready to go every step of the way. SMB lateral movement, automatic. Scripts built, ready to deploy. Every step of the attack is lined up and ready to go. The other version of automation here is also going to be things like ransomware as a service and various brokers. These are lowering the barrier to entry, which I think is something that automation does for a lot of us. It's much easier, to kind of spin up a cloud system than it is to roll your own. Adversaries get the same benefits here. It's much easier to buy access to an environment, or have a middle person sit between you and your victim to help facilitate and negotiate that, because they're better negotiators or they have a better reputation. Or maybe it's easier to simply say, you know what, I want to launch a ransomware attack against this organization, but I don't have any ransom malware. I don't have any ransomware itself, and I'm not really too skilled at how to do this, but I know I want to make some money and I think I've got a good target here. I can outsource and buy all of those and still take a cut. And I mean, if I'm sitting there and I don't have $100,000, and then in a week I do have $100,000, that's going to be a profitable model until we can find a way to put an end to it. So we want to make sure we kind of cut that time in half. My pro tip for everyone here from a security perspective, counter automation with automation. This can be done at multiple levels. It can be done at that perimeter/attack surface detection and knowledge and awareness. It can be done with visibility. It can be done with asset insight. It can be done with prevention and detection. It can be done from response perspectives, playbooks, really all the way from the front end of the cyber kill chain to the end of the cyber kill chain, or the incident response, 6-step incident response process. Look for as many steps of automation as you can in there. And as I've said before on multiple webcasts, and I'll say it again here as well, folks, when I say automation, I don't mean replacing a human being. I mean making human being jobs easier. If I have a high fidelity source of information that comes in, like an Intel feed or something, and that Intel feed is reputed beyond doubt as a great feed, then I should not have a human implementing those blocks when they come in. I already have the trust in place. Drop those blocks in at the network level quickly. Rely on automation the best that you can. Now, with that said, let's take a look at a couple of case studies I've got lined up here. Apologies, panel. I'm going to go through these case studies, and then I will bring you all on to introduce yourselves and then kind of get into our next level of discussion here. But that said, so first thing to be aware of is I've got 2 case studies lined up. These are in the paper as well. So I'm going to kind of look through them quickly. There's a lot of text in here. I don't want to read everything out to y'all. Instead, I want to kind of get you thinking about ways that I can implement defenses at each stage of an attack. So I've got a really high level attack here drawn out. This one starts with, this is our first case study, and it's remote access abuse. And this is where I've got essentially a remote access server facing the internet, used legitimately by an IT admin to do their thing as time goes on. This is pretty common, especially given the landscape we've seen over the past couple of years. And we see access like this sold off to plenty of ransomware adversaries out there as well. And my adversary can quickly, as you can see between steps 1 and step 2, can quickly pivot to look like a legitimate admin, gain secured access into my organization, and move around until they find a way to communicate back via their own C2 or their own implant. The kicker here is I've also got multiple stages of mitigation. So taking a look at where my triangles lay out, A, B, and C, well, my first mitigation is going to be at the perimeter. Can I disable remote access and simply just turn it off as much as I would like to? Unfortunately not. But what I can do instead is I can look for ways to implement stronger authentication. Perhaps I can throw VPNs, multi-factor auth, or a zero trust architecture in there to block out some of the, or limit user access to give them only what they should have access to, as opposed to single factor auth with access to everything. RDP facing the internet with vulnerable services on it. Things like TeamViewer, LogMe, and whatnot running as highly vulnerable services. Don't want to be there at all. We get more into the internal side, and of course, a lot of this is just kind of that defense in-depth approach. We get in the internal side, hopping between a edge into the perimeter is something that should always have its own layer of protection. I want to see network monitoring around this, access controls. There's that zero trust architecture, again, depending on where my environment is set up. But to be able to hop from a remote access system into an internal server should never be limited to a single factor admin account that has crazy privileges to move around. And then really straightforward, step C, or prevention or mitigation technique C, if I've got the adversary's got the ability to get on a system, install malware, eliminate, establish C2 connectivity and things like that, I need to have defenses in place. And that's what I talked about a little bit earlier when it comes to that fileless malware or that more advanced malware side of things. We've got to get to a point where I've got defenses in place that can detect some of these more advanced approaches. And I'm using the air quotes here because if I go to certain folks in information security and I say, hey, isn't PowerShell scripts and fileless malware an advanced topic? They'd laugh in my face and I'd be out the door. But if I go to a lot of folks in the industry and I say, aren't PowerShell scripts and fileless malware advanced? They'd come back and say, we don't even have a way to defend against those. That disconnect, we've got to fix. And we've got to start a technology to fix that because not every, but a lot of times folks in information security read about the way a breach occurred, and that typical blaming, naming, and shaming part comes out where we say, how could someone fall for that thing? And my response to a lot of folks these days is, well, if it's so easy, then you go defend against it, right? You go build the kill switch for all of this, because sitting and saying, how could someone get through with something so easy? It's really easy to blame until you're in that hot seat and you've got to respond to it. We're not here to empower adversaries. We're here to empower defenders. The next case study I'll look at, this is one that focuses more on living off the land binaries. Again, I kept it really high level, really abstracted in this point. But what I want to do is highlight an adversary who works their way into an organization, not from the external side, but more from some sort of an exploit or a malware drop, like an SMB phish or a drive-by or something like that. Sorry, not SMB phish, a spear phish. And then with that spear phish, they're able to move around the environment entirely off of built-in protocols, stolen credentials, and living off the land binaries, meaning they don't need to bring a single piece of malware in after that spear phish takes place. This is once again where we want to look at those next stages of endpoint detection and prevention technology. The first mitigation is going to be if a spear phish is allowed to run a macro or a piece of malicious code, I need to be able to hone in on that. But after that stage, after that exploit hits the system, we then need to focus our defenses on detecting anomalies inside of the environment, detecting anomalies at the system level, malicious use of binaries, abusive living off the land, binaries or LOL bins, if you will. We also need to be able to look at the network level. Is it normal for this type of SMB activity to take place? Is it normal for one account to be spidering out through multiple systems? Is this normal? Is it expected, or is it not? There's lots of really noisy things that adversaries do. And one thing I did not mention, but I was waiting till now, is when you get a highly automated adversary like we've seen, automation means they can move quickly, but it also means they move with signatures, meaning they move with predictable behavior. And I can write detections for those. And last but not least, outbound C2 comms, at some point in time, the adversary's got to break out of the environmental norms. There's often distinct patterns here, things that we can use to detect them. Blending into normal traffic is not as easy as it used to be because unfortunately malware leaves really well-known signatures. And I want to be utilizing intel feeds and utilizing network detection technology to be able to pinpoint and identify things that may be malicious to establish that bidirectional channel. If you look at this diagram, that spear phish is an adversary's way in. It's likely not going to be their primary method of communication. At some point in time, they're going to want to break away from a user account or a user workstation. And they're going to need to set up alternative means of communication. Great, you're leaving more artifacts in the environment for me. So to summarize, before I bring my panelists on, again, at a high level, what I really wanted to do was focus on what are some of the key pinpoints or key pain points we're seeing at a ransomware perspective, what are adversaries still taking advantage of or newly taking advantage of, and what are some things we should consider from a defense mitigation perspective. I'll be the first to say, this was not, as I mentioned, the most conclusive end-all be-all view of ransomware. This is what's working today. This is what adversaries are gaining success with. So let's start to chop those success rates down, and then we'll take a look at the next level. All right, we did this. What did they move to? Here was my reaction, or sorry, here was my action as a defender. What was their reaction as an adversary? So with that said, I'd like to invite my panelists to come on board right now, and let's see here. I'm going to remind everyone that the Q&A window is open. You're more than welcome to submit your questions to us. We do have some things to start our conversation off with from a panel perspective, but I want to give each of my panelists a chance to introduce themselves. So Chris, you popped up first in my panel. So Chris Borales, Michael Gorlick, and then Tom, is it Clavel or Clavel?
Clavel is fine.
Clavel, perfect. Okay, I apologize on saying it incorrectly the first time. And Tom, since you spoke, you moved over to the side, Chris, but I called you out first. So I'm going to give all three of you a chance to introduce yourselves. Tell us who you are, what you do, why you're here with us today. And if you have anything that you, well, we'll wait for the discussion a little bit more. Do me a favor, just go ahead and introduce yourself. Let everyone know who you are.
Sure. So I'm Chris Borales, Senior Manager for Product Marketing at Gigamon for their security solutions. I come to Gigamon by way of, I was a security awareness and education lead at a large media company beforehand. So I'm eyeing the question that's in the Q&A right now. I'm going, I know how we can answer that, but yeah, that's me.
Hi. Awesome. Okay, Tom, you're next.
So I'm next. So I'm Tom Clavel, and I'm director of product marketing at ExtraHop, and I have about 20 years of experience in security. Actually, I used to work at Gigamon. It's a great company, and so I'm coming with the perspective of the very large security organizations such as Cisco and and a few others, AWS and others, and smaller organizations. So I'm happy to jump in on this discussion about ransomware.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom. Looking forward to having you. And last but not least, Michael or Mike, which one do you want to go by?
Anything will work. Mike is fine.
Mike, tell us about yourself.
Hi, Matt, and thank you for having me here. It's a great presentation, definitely. So I'm Michael Gorelick. I'm the CTO of MorphoSec Breach Prevention Company. Essentially, I'm a reverse engineer with 20 years of cybersecurity experience. But the last 8 years, I'm leading as a Chief Technology Officer our MorphoSec company, which is based on MTD, and we'll talk about it, hopefully.
Excellent. Okay, I think we will, Mike. I think we're definitely going to have that lined up. I have a pro tip in the paper, and it's something we'll mention and bring up as well. All right. Well, Chris, I'm coming to you first because you already called it out in your intro. But Tom and Mike, I'll give you guys a chance to comment on this as well. But we did have one question that came in via Zoom. I want to make sure we get to that first. And it says, secure coding and vulnerability prevention are obviously needed to reduce weaponizable vulnerabilities reaching production. So I'm looking at this precursor here as an interesting side that says, rather than limiting the POs, or rather than maximizing the POC development, instead, let's minimize the number of vulnerabilities. Vulnerability prevention and secure coding are needed to reduce this. Do you have any advice on working with developers from the perspective of security? So, Chris, you brought this up in your intro, so I'll come to you first. But the question essentially boils down to, are there ways we can work with developers from a security perspective to minimize this vulnerability footprint in the future?
So yes, I did mention it because, part of my role at my last organization was doing this I want to say sort of basic blocking and tackling, right? Starting with the basics, making sure that the development teams know the OWASP top 10. They know the organization's policies, standards, and baselines. Do they know their tool stack? Do they know certain misconfigurations that they need to be, or do they know how to configure maybe that new S3 bucket that's going to be spun up? But it all sort of boils down to, like I said, that basic blocking and tackling. It's very much policies, standards, and baselines. I think we can kind of boil it down to that. There are a lot of training tools out there that sort of help provide secure, sort of a secure coding practice, but it varies so much by organization. It's really hard to sort of standardize that in a commercially available tool. But yeah, I think it really does start with the basics there. So ensuring that your organization, your developers know those basics and know where to access resources that can help them sort of develop in a secure way in the future. I know that sounds a little mundane, but I think it really does start with those foundational principles.
Gotcha. Okay, Mike or Tom, anything to add on?
Yeah, sure. Code security and code is one of the first principle you would learn also as a CISO or CSSP. It's a basic principle. OWASP, Chris mentioned OWASP. Obviously, knowing how to write code securely is very important. Nevertheless, there will be always developers that will write fast and quick to provide the functionality. In today's world, it's more and more applications, more and more functionality, more and more usability. So developers with the quick CI/CD are moving to production quicker than ever before. So I suspect that attack surface will always be there. Obviously, there are the education parts and the training, but there is some acceptance that vulnerability will be there. So what can you do?
Yeah, valid point. Very, very valid point. That's a good perspective, Mike, I think. Just commenting that. Tom, I want to get your take on this too. But yeah, I think both of you had offered kind of this good opinion on, I don't know, I really view this as kind of this battle between devs and security that's going to be there for a long time. And I think there are some approaches we're taking. Tom, anything you got to add on there?
Yes, absolutely. So I thought that Chris and Michael made very good points about securing the code and having all the basics up and the basic hygiene including. I would add that Matt, you made a very good point in your presentation when you talked about things like lateral movement and so on, because we have to be focused on the basics, but we also have to be able to look at what's happening inside the network. And so when you're trying to prevent vulnerabilities, it's one thing, but it's not always possible to do 100% prevention, 100% hygiene and patching and so on. I think at the end of the day, you have to have a tool that's able to look inside what's happening on your network, detect things like lateral movement, for instance, be able to detect target enumeration and so on. And that is a fundamental element of any good security posture. The question about developments is really a question also about supply chain issues. And as you know, when the code is not perfect, you have vulnerabilities, you have risk of supply chain attacks, and that's when you have to have a very good security inside your network, not just on the perimeter.
Yeah, agreed. Valid points across the board, guys. Thank you. All right. Next question we've had come in, and again, I'm looking at. Oh, fantastic! All right, we've got a live audience now. We've got more questions coming in. So because we kind of because I ran the gamut of different ransomware aspects, these questions are going to be kind of pinpointed all over the place as well. So one that's just come in are talking about C2 communications and looking for. Let's see, perfect. What tools do you suggest to monitor for C2 communications to look for display traits mentioned and bidirectional channel traffic just versus, okay, perfect. Let me rephrase this. What would you recommend looking for C2 traits and characteristics as opposed to just blocking known bad IPs or domains? And I'll go ahead and kind of give the first example here. I mentioned it during the webcast. I think domain fronting is a perfect example of this because this is a technology that tends to hide behind legitimate looking domains. I'm not blocking those domains, but it is malicious traffic behind it. And I think there's a couple different answers here. The first one does focus at the network side of detection, that like packet inspection. And this is definitely going back in technology terms, but still very relevant from a technology perspective of looking into packets if possible, looking for the various traits and the various traits and characteristics, such as, high speed frequencies of communications, large outbound transfers. From a ransomware perspective, if you think about those ransomware breaches where the organization, or not the organization, but the adversary comes back and says, hey, not only did we ransom you, but we also took 500 gigs worth of your data, and here's proof that we did. Folks, I'm gonna be honest with you. 500 gigs is not a lot in the sense of data, but it's a lot of data coming out of one workstation, or if it's a lot of data coming out of a relatively obscure pipe, if you will. So I would say, looking for like traffic volumes, traits like that are really easy ways to kind of work around. Hey, I only block known bad IPs. I'd be curious though, panel, you guys have any other things you've been looking for? Mike, I noticed you just came off mute, so I'll come to you first. Tom, and then Chris, I'm gonna let you go last because you were nodding along feverishly as I was going. So Mike, you're first.
Thanks, Matt. So it's an interesting question. I'm doing incident response at least 2 or 3 events per week with all the different types of compromises. I find many attackers are compromising and doing C2 communications from already compromised sites. So you may compromise one customer and then get to the other one, customer, target, victim, and jumping from one victim to another. So it's really difficult today, basically block based on IP, though it's possible, obviously depending on the maturity of the attacker. There are ways to block, for example, COBOL communications based on headers, etc. And as you mentioned, they are hiding under HTTPS and other communication, which have, try to filter those out. You will damage the visibility of your organization. So obviously there are the difficulties. Obviously, it is better to prevent the attack earlier on. By different means, whether it's deception, moving target defense, or even attack surface reduction. Now, we find in many of the incidents, attackers are hijacking some server that has outbound communication, right? So they, as you mentioned, they exfiltrate the information, they do whatever. But we find in many cases, there is no need for outbound communication to be even open from those servers. And if you want those updates, you can do the right work, hardening your environment, do the right updates for your servers without opening outbound to the whole world. So there are ways to reduce the attack surface and handle this even before. But when a real attacker really want to get out and your environment is not hardened enough, it will be really difficult to just identify based on network communication.
Agreed. Agreed. Very good point to add on to that. I think, yeah, well said, Mike. Well said. I think understanding that, adversaries, there's also, it's important to understand, and Tom, hopefully I'm not going to step on too much of what you've got to say, but along with some of the technologies we talked about, adversaries also tend to face that path of least resistance. And believe it or not, they'll go over plain text protocols if they can. And there's a lot of malware still in 2022 that deploys with HTTP comms built in. Folks, that's plain text. I'll go back, a year and some change in time. If everyone remembers that, big SolarWinds breach took over the news for a long time. Folks, C2 stage 1 was DNF on that one, right? So to say that it's always going to be hidden inside of things that's hard to see is definitely not going to always be true. So look for, unique detection opportunities there. Tom, what do you got to add on from a kind of, how do we go beyond just blocking IPs from a network perspective?
Absolutely. So there's a couple of things, and I think it's going to touch to a few things that you mentioned in your presentation, Matt. First of all, everybody is familiar with the defender's dilemma, which states that when the adversary is attacking your network, they have the advantage because they can choose how, when, where they're gonna attack, and they're gonna repeat this again and again until they are successful. But then once they are post-compromise, once they're inside your network, at a state that we call the mid game, then they have to be very discreet because until they have the entire exploit executed, they are vulnerable. And that's where you have the advantage. That's where you can block them. So what they do is that they're going to exploit common traffic, and especially encrypted traffic, SMBv3, MSRPC, and so on. And so you want to have a tool that's enabling you to look inside that encrypted traffic to identify exactly what's being carried over the traffic, so that you can disrupt the C2, the command and control, and the other strategies that are being implemented by the ransomware.
All right, Chris, what do you got to add on?
So I think Tom and I, regarding SSL or being able to decrypt that encrypted traffic, we're on the same page there for sure. You need a tool that's going to be able to do that. But I wonder if there's also this, we want to be able to also enable this proactive security posture for our SOC teams. We want to make sure that they are, are they looking at, when you were mentioning, packet inspection, are they taking a look at potential malicious traffic on the network? Are they in a position to do that with the tools, with the tools that they have in their stack? They need to be able to be sort of enabled to do that proactive, to have that proactive security, to be able to hunt for those threats. And they need tools to be able to do that. So regardless of whether or not, the initial question, regarding looking at C2, if they're looking at command control and they're looking for, sort of these initial breadcrumbs of potential malicious traffic that you're, things that look anomalous. If you have a SOC team that's focused on proactively looking for those anomalies, as opposed to looking for a real alert per se, but something that might be, this is potentially risky, we need to be looking more into that. They need to have that hypothesis, or they need to be able to test that hypothesis, sort of in a scientific way. But they need to be able to have that. They need to be enabled to do that proactive hunting on the network. I think that's a key point there.
Gotcha. Excellent. Valid points, panel. I think these are perhaps some of the most important questions too that come through. I'm going to rope this into another question we've got lined up. And those of you asking questions, I see you. If it feels like I'm getting out of place, I'm trying to go in chronological order, but also I'm trying to rope things in, as best as possible as well. And there was a question that came in, and I think it's kind of on the lines of kind of detecting that advanced technology to detect C2s and kind of that next stage of network comms. And the question was, what automated response actions would you recommend to implement on various stages of ransomware attack? So team, panel, I'll give you all a moment to think about this. Chris, I'm going to ask you to just keep your mic on. I'm going to come to you first on this one. And then we'll go Tom and then Mike to give you all a approach on that. But I'll happily start the answer so you can think this one through. So from an automation perspective, I dropped a line in there, which was like, hey, you can automate too. And I make it sound like it's really, really easy for an organization to do. But the first note I drop is one I did mention, find that high source of fidelity that you can, whether it's a threat intel feed, if it's, kind of custom environment-based detections or something like that, where, the statistical percentage of me responding to this incorrectly, if you will, is very low. And what I mean by that, I'll give this case study. If someone comes through and says, I'm going to send you a list of, IP addresses or C2 profiles or network traffic indicators or something, or endpoint indicators that are really, really high fidelity, I'm going to lean on that confidence level. I'm just going to say, you know what, just block, right? And I'm not going to not vet, but I'm going to vet with a little bit of admitted bias. If I've got a person who never lies, after a long-term relationship, I'm going to start to be like, okay, perfect. Let's hope this person's never lied to me again. I'm getting way off topic here, but the point being, rely on the fidelity, number one. Also rely on things custom to your environment as well. Meaning if someone comes down and gives us a piece of intel that says, hey, you are in the manufacturing industry, and here's intel about a target targeting the manufacturing industry, or a adversary targeting the manufacturing industry, and 4 and 5 of your peers have been hit by this thing. And, the defenses you have in place are the things they like to topple over. Right? If all the statistics are leaning towards, wow, I'm a really easy target, that might cause me to ratchet up the automation a little bit, and instead say, you know what, I would rather we prevent a ransomware attack than I, accidentally let something through. That's never a situation or a position we want to be in. So I might, depending on knowledge of the threat actor, but I will say, regardless, knowledge of the threat actor is going to have to be an important step to all of this, because that's the thing that tells me what I'm looking out for. Now, before I hand it over, Chris, I'm going to ask you to go first. But before I do this, Mike, I know you wanted to talk. When you answer this, I'd like you to also take a chance to talk about kind of that moving target defense as well, because I know that's something that you're well versed in. And I think that also aligns with, do we need to focus so much on response, or can we move back towards prevention a little bit? Because if I can prevent more, then I can respond less. All right. Now, panel, if you guys, I'm sorry, I'm front loading all of this for you three. After we answer this question, I want to move to the next one we have in line, which talks about the response side. So let's happily talk about response actions, a little bit of prevention, and then we're going to get down into the whole, like, no, you've been ransomed, here's what to do next phase. All right. So mentally getting you ready for what's coming on here, but let's go ahead. Chris, I'll let you come off mute and I'll let you answer this one first, and then we'll go kind of in that Tom, Mike order, and then we'll head to the next one.
So are we still answering the question regarding automated responses?
Yes, sir. Automated response actions. Chris, I'm blending these together. I'm giving you a chance to mentally think about, okay, hold on, how can I rope these in? Because I feel like our attendees are asking a lot of the same stuff, which is, how can I respond to this better?
Sure.
Right. So I'm going to answer both of these questions live.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what I think is, I don't know if, so we have, you're going to, at least when you're looking at, sort of on the network side from an NDR perspective, you're going to be looking at things that are really relying on AI, machine learning to sort of look for anomalous behavior, to sort of trigger those detections, find those, and create those alerts for your SOC teams. I think that's a great first step, but I think it really needs to be paired with some sort of behavioral, those sort of automated machine learning AI detections need to be paired with some human expertise to provide that behavioral analysis that can sort of give a little bit more of a qualification to something that would normally be an automatic, oh my gosh, this is something that the SOC team needs to investigate right now. There's a little bit of, like I said, the qualification that happens there. That's something that we really don't, or SOC teams can rely on to create a more high fidelity alert that is something that is really actionable, as opposed to something that might end up being a false positive. Matt, I don't know if you want me to pass it over to. Oh.
Yeah, no, sorry, Tom, go ahead. I briefly had to go on mute for a second, but Tom, feel free to add some flavor to that.
Absolutely, and I agree with what Chris was saying. I think what we tend to focus on at ExtraHub is really to decrease the skill threshold that is required, and so we make a huge use, a very important use of AI ML to be able to have detections and to have the proper detections. And so definitely make use of AI ML. That's very important. The second point I would make is try to leverage multiple tools and try to integrate them, because you're going to find data that is very important amongst different tools, and you need to be able to recoup that data, that information across the tools that you have. And so whether it be SIEM, whether it be EDR or NDR, and so on, and so that part integration is an important element of your security posture. The other thing, I think the other part of your question, Matt, was in regards to the post compromise. What happens once you're being ransomed? So at ExtraHub, what we do is we really focus on reducing the blast radius, because it's very important to minimize the impact of any ransom or ransomware, and so that's why it's so important to detect early on and isolate and mitigate the issues before the ransom happens. After, if all else fails and you're still being ransomed, I think the issue is not just about it's not just about a matter of backups, because we know that 100% backup is not possible. There's always going to be a certain part of data that's going to be lost, and you also have to weigh the other elements to the ransom, because you have ransom, but you have damage to the reputation, you have damage to your suppliers as well, and so on. And all of these back up. We've determined that the real cost of a ransom is about 10 times the cost of the actual ransom, and because of all the other elements that come in play once you're being ransomed. And back to my earlier point, that's the reason why we're so focused on early detection and reducing the blast radius to minimize that.
Love it. No, Tom, valid point. Mike, what do you got to add for us?
Thanks, Matt. So basically, a couple of things. I think the question was very good, and specifically they asked on the different stages of the ransomware. What is the response, right? It's whether it's initially or at the end. And I think it was a good point by Tom, talking about deep depth defense and multiple solutions to really provide a good security posture. So if I just a second think about the attack chain or the ransomware in a whole, starting from as you mentioned in the different scenarios, starting from the phishing or credential theft or whatever, and getting essentially to execute these backdoors, and then going through the lateral movement, eventually exfiltration and ransomware, and then all the stuff of backups. So essentially, as you suggested, there are automatic playbooks of response, and you're using IOCs for the credential stuff, isolation, containment, automatic containment. If you identify some kind of indications of anomalies, you know your environment better, as Matthew mentioned. Obviously, containment is much better than now executing and applying all your DRP plans. Disaster recovery, it's better to contain and prevent this earlier. And here, basically, where we play well, moving target defenses is something that makes the attack surface unpredictable, but basically dynamic. And this is what we do. We shuffle and change how the endpoint landscape or attack surface looks like. And therefore, we succeed to contain the attack before it executed, actually on the stages of the backdoor and even earlier. No one is foolproof. No one is 100%. So we need deep depth defense all across. Obviously, if you get to the ransomware, you definitely need to, you have your playbooks, you need your tabletop exercises, you need to know that your recovery works, you need to know to get back to your functionality, business critical functionality of your organization. So essentially, you need to plan for this to happen. There are different studies that say in Canada, more than 60-something% have been attacked at least once by ransomware during the year. It's crazy, right? So essentially, you need to be ready with all the different steps. And obviously, containment of the event earlier on, it's better than responding it on a later stage.
Yeah, these are all valid points. Chris and Tom, I'm not sure if you have anything you want to add on to what Mike was saying. I know that some other questions we've had come in talk kind of about the preparation of dealing with attacks, responding to attacks, things like that. And I think, I think we're kind of answering a lot of those questions as we work our way through this as well, which is good. A really valid point is to kind of approach that. How do we deal with this from the varying sliding scales of response capabilities, right? There is that kind of question of, hey, if I get breached and this occurs, what do I do with it? Versus kind of, Mike, I think where you're trying to slide that scale up a little bit more towards, no, let's try and get ahead of it. And I think all of us are saying, that the more we can implement those preventative measures, whether it's a business strategy / process and policy, or whether it's technology that's helping us with that. I think, we're all moving in the same direction, which is a very, very valuable step to be in. Let's talk a little bit about adversaries. There's another question that's come in. And just kind of to repeat the pattern from before, Chris, I'll come to you first on this one. But there's a question that's been, how has the shift to from an adversary perspective, we're seeing these, and I talked about this briefly, these trends in extortion, where we're not just seeing kind of those single notes anymore. It's now advanced to, really more advanced. I know my victim, I know their environment. Not only that, but I'm going to publicly name and shame them. I've got, sites that we put stuff up. We're going to release little pieces of data and things like that. How do we think, or how do you, panel, think that double, triple extortion threat has affected kind of the ransomware issue? So Chris, I'll come to you first. And then again, just because we'll repeat from before, Chris, Tom, and then Mike, I'll finish with you on this one. And then we might be close to the end of today's webcast, guys. But so I want to make sure I give you all time to do a little bit of outro as well. So Chris, go ahead.
Sure. So, how have the ransomware actors shifted how they're shifting to this extortion model where, I know during your part of the session, you asked about, is ransomware going to go away? And we hope so, but they're really building this whole, there's a business model around it, and it's only getting more lucrative. So I don't think that, with this increase in double, triple extortion, they're able to find new and unique and creative ways to just turn those screws a little more in those potential victims. There's a a storage provider recently that was compromised. And what happened was the initial ransomware attack wasn't on the storage provider. It was actually on the customers of the storage provider. And like you said, they were named and shamed. Every one of these customers got an email that said, this is not any fault of your own. The security vendor that you chose to, go with your storage had lax security, and now your storage, or now all of your assets are being ransomed. Pay us 0.3 Bitcoin or whatever it was. But as you see this model shift where you have, again, you have initial access brokers that are, providing access to systems to that, for that initial compromise. You have, this sort of like mini ecosystem here. I hate to say that it's only going to get worse. But I have a feeling like they're just going to keep coming up with new ways to make money because it's so financially, it is so financially advantageous for them. And
yeah, it's a lucrative industry.
Yeah, we just need to be more diligent about it, from a the security side. Mm-hmm.
Agreed. Tom or Mike, anything to add?
Yeah, I think to Chris's point, I don't think it's going to go away. But the thing is, it's always going to evolve. What this has changed concretely is that in doing this double take, of exfiltrating the data and using it against the victim if they don't pay the ransom, I think they've done this to increase their propensity of success. But it really shifted two things. First of all, there's a stronger emphasis in prevention, in blocking the ransomware. That has become much more important than before, whereas in the past, people would think, well, I'm just going to pay the ransom and it's going to go over. And but the reality is that once the data is out there, there's always a risk, and there's always a chance the data can be used against you, and even when you pay the ransom. And so that has shifted the importance of protection against ransomware. That's for sure. The second element is that it's also enabled the ransomware to go after bigger and larger targets. And whereas we would see before the ransomware go after smaller organizations, non-security mature organizations. Now, those ransomware have adopted advanced threat, APT, advanced persistent threat tactics, and so that's the reason why they're exfiltrating the data, and that's why they're going after the larger organizations. So it's made the ransomware problem even bigger and even more important to go after and control.
Agreed. Mike, anything to add? And this might be our final comment of the day.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try to mention two things. Obviously, I agree with Chris and Tom. There's major advances. Attackers are advancing much quicker than many of the defenders. Though there are existing technologies, and people need to understand and work on a deep dive defense approach, as I mentioned before. Nevertheless, it's important to mention, at least my personal opinion, with today's political landscape change, the war in Ukraine and everything, I suspect that this year will be crazy and unpredictable. I believe that during the short time, more of healthcare and government, sectors will be attacked where it hurts for the people. For the long run, with the isolation of Russia and the change in landscape, I believe any businesses will be attacked and because of the currency of Bitcoin and the need of people there to gain money. Anyone with a weak security posture will be attacked. You cannot say you are not being attacked. You are maybe too rich or too poor or whatever. Everyone will be attacked, and you need to prepare right now. For the long run, it will. My personal prediction, it will be crazy, I would say.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I think that might be all the time we have for today. I'm looking at the clock, looking at the questions lined up, and I think unfortunately we're probably at the end of it. So, Carol, I'm going to hand it over to you to take us off. But before I do, Tom, Chris, Mike, I appreciate you giving me a chance to join you today. Appreciate you having me on and having this really interesting discussion. I think this is going to be a very impactful presentation for a while to come. So on behalf of all of us, thank you all very much. Appreciate it. Thanks for joining us. To everyone in the community, thank you for joining us as well. We had quite a few people hang on for quite a while today. So as always, pleasure bringing this content to you, pleasure being able to work through this, and really looking forward to kind of seeing some of these trends decline in the future. I'd really love to see adversaries not have so much success in the future. With that said, Carol, I'll let you take us home, but thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Always a pleasure to be here with the SANS community.
All right. Thank you so much, Matt, Chris, Tom, and Michael, for your great presentation. And to Cisco Secure, CoreLight, ExtraHop, Gigamon, and Morphosec for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.